the Prophet, God, Islam and Muslims. No one should ever take that right away. But you could be critical without the need to ridicule. Respect is a two-way street. I believe that the legacy of the Prophet Muhammad will far outlive all forms of mockery.
Well, if you have a webcam, you can make your point on Skype, or you can join the conversation on Twitter, phone, text or email. The details are all on the screen. And joining us for this discussion is Ajmal Masroor, who just made that film. He's an imam and a member of the Muslim Council of Britain. And in the 2010 general election, he stood for the Liberal Democrats in the London constituency of Bethnal Green and Bow. Welcome to you. I want to start with you, Mohammed. Muslims have chosen, in a way, to make a very big deal out of a pretty rubbish film. And it has been an overreaction, hasn't it?
There's no doubt it's a rubbish film, but this isn't film 2012. We're not here to critique the artistic quality of the film. What most people, and people I speak to on Twitter, people I speak to in the street and at meetings, one of the things they're very clear about is that they don't understand the context of the hate, of the pain, of the suffering that Muslims feel in response. Now, Muslims should never go beyond the limits and the boundaries of Islam in terms of peaceful protest and have it using
well, they've done it, haven't they?
Well, some have done it, and I think the question we should be asking is some, not all.
Yeah.
Many. I've seen the film. It was not very funny. It was pretty disgusting. It was awful in some places. We do have a right to freedom of expression in this country. However, even the European Convention on Human Rights, in Article 10.2, sets limits on that freedom of expression, and it needs to be used responsibly, and it needs to be used in a measured sense.
I mean, Douglas Murray, what's interesting is, it says that perhaps in the West we've lost any understanding of the depth of offence that things like this cause to Muslims, and is that a problem of our own making?
I think that's true in a way. Just quickly, I mean, the thing of saying Muslims, of course, in this, is that in most countries there's a very small minority of people. I mean, and also we should bear in mind that a lot of political people are using this for their benefit. In Australia, the riots would seem to be led by, organisations like Hizb ut-Tahrir. In Britain, the very small number of protesters who came out seem to have been affiliated with groups like the now banned Al-Mujahirun and so on. So let's not think this is, as it were, Muslims as a bloc taking offence. But there is a correct perception, I think, that that Islam as a religion is more brittle and feels these things more woundedly than other religions, and there is a reason for that. I mean, in a couple of weeks' time in London, the musical by the creators of South Park, Mormonism the Musical, will begin. It's been going on Broadway for some years, to pack out crowds, including Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State, who said she was so offended by this film on the internet. So one of the things about this is that most religions by now have realised that being satirised, being critiqued, being even ridiculed and criticised, let's face it, just criticised or looked at in a historical manner, as happened a few weeks ago with a film by Tom Holland on Channel 4. Even these things are felt very woundedly, and that's because all other religions, apart from Islam, have been through this period of criticism and have, as it were, come out to some extent, not completely, at the other end. Islam has not been used to this process, historically. It is not used to the idea that your deepest feelings can be trodden upon, and that is a right that people who do not share your faith
Douglas,
have.
what on earth are you talking about? Because how can Islam, which is a faith, it's a religion, it's an ideology, it's a way of life, you cannot talk about Islam in these broad, sweeping generalisations.
Well, you talked about Muslims
Islam doesn't feel things. Individual Muslims do, people who are mothers and fathers.
Can I get Ajmal?
If I could just
go ahead, Douglas,
quickly
respond
to that, because it is a very important point. There are lots of different strands of Islam, but in every Islamic society, and in the world today, and historically.
Do you mean Muslim majority countries?
No. Islamic societies that have Islam within the rule of law, countries like Pakistan, where Islam is a very important part of the constitution and of the governance of the country. These places all put a particular emphasis on the fact that the ridiculing of the Prophet Muhammad, or all sorts of claims about him, asking whether he existed and so on, is blasphemy, and that blasphemy should be punished.
I mean, Ajmal, it is an issue about those countries, isn't it? And it's all very well for you in the West to say, look, you can rise above it. But in Pakistan, in Yemen, in these places where there's been violence, they can't, can they?
I've got simply 3 points to make on this particular discussion. I think there's one correction for Douglas's information. Islam has been through 1400 years of critique, discussions and debates, internally and externally. And it has gone through it without a problem, and it will go through it without any issue. I have no issue with that. I think there is an element of truth in what we are saying here, to do with Muslims' disproportionate response. The reasons these responses are particularly prominent in countries like Pakistan, Yemen, in Bangladesh, has more to do with politics than religion. Let me give you an example.
Very briefly.
Most of these countries are ruled by dictators and despots. Illegitimate governments, corruption is rampant, poverty is acute, no opportunities for people to make a better future for themselves tomorrow. And don't forget, the drones attack that has dominated Yemen and Pakistan has also exasperated frustration. So what we are now seeing is a political response using this as a pretext.
As an excuse.
But Prophet Muhammad, let me put it clearly,
Yeah.
Prophet Muhammad doesn't need our defense.
Okay.
And God doesn't need our defense.
All right,
what
let's
we need to
Douglas
do is
answer
defend
that.
ourselves.
Okay.
Absolutely. The second point you make, I think, is perfectly valid. The first, I think, is not. For this reason. You say that Islam has been through this process for 1400 years. A part of that is true. There has been debate within Islam. But on the fundamentals of Islam, about the nature of Muhammad, about whether or not he existed, even, whether the Quran was created by him or was created by God, whether he invented it, these things actually Islamic society has tended to, and Muslims even today, feel very brittle about. The fact is, and all singing...
Do you want me to name you scholars?
Let Douglas just finish, please.
Yes, and I could name them back, and many have suffered for raising these questions when they have. The fact is that we can put it this way: an all-singing, all-dancing Mormon musical is a threat to nobody. Nobody thinks that Mormon mobs are going to go and kill anybody, or threaten to. But there is a risk, and it is a legitimate risk in the world today, that an all-singing, all-dancing Muhammad musical in the West End might not go off
Samira,
so
there is
well.
a very simple thing. If I keep insulting you, if I keep offending you, there is a limit to what I call freedom of speech. You cannot keep insulting me and offending me. I would turn around and say, Samira, your joke is not funny, please stop it. Eventually you'll stop. Do you know why? Because you'd respect me. You'd be kind and courteous to me. And
but this is about belief and not about individuals. I want to pause it there for a second.
A billion people are simply saying, what is wrong with accepting that we have the right to revere and follow our Prophet in the way we do. But you have the right to criticize our religion, no problem. Be critical, but don't ridicule.
All right. Well, okay, let's bring in a couple of other contributors. We're joined by Miriam Francois Serra, who's a freelance journalist. You've been hearing the discussion here. I just wonder if we could go back to that point about how far it's politics picking up on an excuse to stir up trouble for their own ends. Is that what this is really about?
I certainly think when we're looking at the international dimension, we have to look at the places where the protests have been most violent, and they have been concentrated in countries which have recently experienced periods of upheaval, be they recent revolutions, be they wars. We spoke about drone attacks in Pakistan, in Yemen, where some of the most violent protests did occur. And so I think, if you like, I would interpret the film as being more of a focal point, which has allowed broader popular anger about a wide range of issues, including concerns about local government corruption, but also US intervention in the region and the impact that the American war on terror has had on many innocent civilians in the region. And so all of that anger and frustration which has been fermenting has expressed itself, and then it's become instrumentalized by various political parties, more or less extreme in the region, for their own ends, to destabilize local governments, to advance their own ends.
Miriam, thank you. I want to bring in A.B. Bowman now, who's a stand-up comedian. Now, you've done comedy about Islam and Christianity. In fact, you performed Jesus the Guantanamo Years in Pakistan, I understand. What do you make of this idea that we can't ridicule Muslims? I mean, are Muslims too easily offended or not?
Well, my experience in Pakistan, and I think it's worth reminding your audience that Jesus is a prophet in Islam, so to depict him on stage, I should have, under the Taliban, would have been sort of beheaded for that. But my experience was that the audience in Pakistan were extraordinarily open to that. And I would agree with what your other commentators have said, that Islam is a much wider religion than just one. You know, there's 1.3 billion Muslims in the world, so even if there were 13 million rampaging, flag-burning suicide bombers, that would be 1% of Islam, and there's nowhere near 13 million. The number of suicide bombers is going down all the time.
Well, what do you think of the idea that, you know, we're somehow supposed to self-censor in case people choose to make political capital out of it? I mean, there's no connection between this film and drones, but it seems to be a reason given not to allow any films like this to be made or promoted.
Well, I would say that there is definitely a political context for this, and I think it's important to remember that particularly in Egypt and in Libya, where this kicked off, under the dictatorships of Gaddafi and Mubarak, the government controlled all media. So if something was in the newspaper, it's because the government said it was okay. So it's as if, for a Western audience, you've been reading Hello magazine all your life, and then one day you picked up a copy of Hello and it said, President Barack Obama shows us around his lovely White House home, and then talks about his deep contempt for the Prophet Muhammad. You'd assume that he'd okayed that because that's what Hello magazine is, and that's the media people are used to. I do think that basically there's a sort of underlying point of anger against the West, against us for arming dictators and stealing oil and so on for a long time, and that can then be tipped over using religion as the touch paper to light that attack. I have to say I was hugely encouraged by the huge attacks yesterday on the militias who actually killed the ambassador, that so many Libyans actually rose up and said, this is not okay with us and we want you out.
Now, this is interesting. In Benghazi, of course, they've driven out the Islamists, which is a big story in the news today. Thank you very much, Abi. Can I quickly bring in Benjamin Lazarus, who's a freelance journalist? It may be frustrating, but isn't it reasonable to say we know what happens when these kinds of films are made and promoted on the internet, and we need to compromise to avoid fueling more violence?
Absolutely not. That would be to cower in the face of sadomasochistic rage. And I think frustrating is perhaps a sort of obscurantist term. I think it would actually be abhorrent. We would sort of have to police society in a sort of Orwellian fashion whereby bearded backwater clerics became the thought police and could monitor what elements of history we were permissible to study, what novels could be written, what we could watch on the internet, and so on.
Okay.
I don't see how that would be an acceptable situation whatsoever. And we should not be sort of intimidated by violence. And we went through the Enlightenment so that no single fanatical gang could enforce their will as the truth.
Benjamin.
So it'd be an awful submission now to accept Islam as the truth.
Benjamin, thank you very much. And listen, I want to ask you something, Mohammed Ansar. We're in this position, and Douglas mentioned it, where a scholarly documentary about the origins of Islam, is the maker of that, Tom Holland, is an academic, he's getting death threats. I looked at some of the comments he was getting on Twitter, really aggressive, from people who actually in sometimes quite important positions in the Islamic community in Britain. It has gone too far, hasn't it?
I'm a friend of Tom's. I've been very outspoken in the media and with Tom. They do this history festival, which is like a Glastonbury for history geeks.
Answer the question.
But his book was an academic discussion about the origins of Islam. And although I didn't like the information in it, it was roundly set upon by Muslim and non-Muslim academics across the world.
Well, that's not entirely true. Do you accept the idea that death threats are completely wrong in this context?
Of course they are. Nobody sensible would condone that kind of behaviour. However, an academic discourse, as set out in Tom's book, was fine, as set out in his lectures are fine, but in the documentary, where he throws away any balance to the discussion and produces a very prejudicial and biased aspect.
In your opinion?
Glenn Bowersock, who was the head of history and classics at Harvard for something like 20 years, he's came out very, very strongly, and he's not Muslim, and he said this is shocking revisionism and
But it's the tone of the discussion. Go ahead,
I think the point about Tom Holland, he has the right to say what he wants to say. That's not a problem. Death threat is absolutely abhorrent. It's not Islamic. It's not befitting to be a good Muslim to say something like that. Absolutely. Forget about all of that. That's very simple. It's a human judgment on this issue. But the issue is, did Tom Holland do a good job of an objective program? I believe he didn't, number one. Number two, is just like the cartoonist who did new cartoons in France. We know from good sources that that newspaper or that magazine was financially struggling. Let's make a bit of money by putting up a cartoon that would sell a lot more.
So everyone's got an interest in stirring up trouble.
And this is the problem.
I want to give Douglas the last word on this.
It comes down to a very fundamental point. Most people in this country are not Muslim, most people in France are not Muslim, and so on. We don't believe that Muhammad, if he existed, heard any angels speaking. It's the opinion of those of us who are not Muslim that he obviously either made it up or something else. Now, we think the same thing about Mormonism. Atheists obviously will believe the same thing about Jesus and about Moses and so on. But nobody has a problem saying, I'll make a film about Moses where he's made up the Ten Commandments. It was done very well by Mel Brooks. But nobody has a problem now watching a film saying that Jesus made it up. But they do have a problem, and we have a problem of censorship and self-censorship, because people are afraid to say that Muhammad made it all up, and the response to that, they know, is that they will stop saying it, they will pretend
and hope they won't get any trouble, because they will pretend that they are sort of believing Islam. They'll say the Prophet Muhammad. They will try not to cause any offence.
All right, well, we'll have to leave it there. No, we have run out of time on this. The only thing I would say is we have run out of time. It is interesting that we're 22, 23 years after the Satanic Verses affair, and here we are embroiled in this discussion with Fari as well.
We can't fight constantly.
But thank you all very much for your contributions on that.